Cape York is just the tip of a peninsula that's one of Australia's greatest unpopulated areas, big enough to accommodate England and Wales with space left over. Yet it's almost totally unpopulated. There are very few towns, and the Aborigines who are scattered throughout the region now live mainly in a few concentrated settlements. The only other people you'll find at the very top of the Australian continent are those who've come to visit, and a few people who are here to accommodate them. The beaches are beautiful spots, but there are hidden dangers, something that seems lost on some of the people who make it this far north. Perhaps the fact that they've overcome the difficulties of a hard drive to the top makes them feel invulnerable. But this is crocodile country, and apart from that, the water itself is dangerous. The tip marks the meeting of two oceans, the Indian and Pacific, and the tides that rip through the narrow passages between the islands create treacherous eddies and currents. Engine failure could mean being swept out to sea or halfway along the Torres Straits in the space of a few hours. The people have to live with isolation. Their shopping comes from Cairns, 800 kilometres to the south. And for families, there are other problems to overcome.
Good morning, Mrs. Shepherd. How are you today, Mrs. Shepherd?
Hi, very well, thank you, Gary. Leander?
Apart from the occasional young visitor, Gary Wright's only contact with children his own age is through the School of the Air. His parents work at Wilderness Lodge, and that makes Gary a very isolated child. He can claim the distinction of being the continent's most northern student.
Call in anyone else who had a look at the moon last night.
Gary!
Gary did. What was it like, Gary?
Pretty fat, Mrs. Shepherd.
Pretty fat. Oh, it's going to get a bit fatter yet, though.
As difficult as everyday life can be in the remote north, at least today they have modern technology to make it possible. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like when the first arrivals tried to beat the Cape. Explorer Edmund Kennedy and 9 of his 12 men perished in 1848 in an effort to explore the land and reach the tip. Some died of hunger and disease. Others, like Kennedy himself, were speared by the blacks. He probably would have survived the native attacks if he hadn't been so weakened by the tropical heat and the rugged terrain. The area just south of the tip is called the Lockerbie Scrub, which includes some of the thickest rainforest in Australia. I've just pushed through a couple of 100 metres of Lockerbie Scrub, and it's an exercise like that that makes you realise what the early explorers actually went through. They had to carry their gear, and they had to fight hostile natives along the way. They were doomed. But just a few years after that, 2 brothers, Frank and Alex Jardine, performed one of the greatest feats of Australian frontier history. They did more than just cover the same ground. The Jardine boys drove a mob of 250 cattle the entire length of Cape York. They literally fought their way through. The number of Aborigines they shot will never be known. In one pitched battle, they killed around 30, and there were many more along the entire journey. Frank led the expedition at the age of 21. Alec was only 20. This astonishing saga of Australia's early days centres around a place that today is nothing more than a few scattered relics. Even to call them ruins would be to overstate what's left of a centre that was planned as an Australian Singapore. There's barely a trace of the government town of Somerset, established in 1864 under the command of the Jardine boys' father, a Scottish aristocrat. John Jardine didn't stay long. His health failed and command passed to Frank. Ruthless, ambitious and thoroughly hardened by his running battle with the blacks in his cattle drive up the Cape. Eyewitnesses tell how he shot a tribal chief from the veranda of his house and then, saying he'd shot a crocodile, sent other tribesmen to retrieve the body. Another eyewitness tells how he gunned down islanders in the surf, shouting the words, "By Jove, duck hunting." He was feared by everyone in the north, but to the terrified blacks, he was a living devil. The natives credited Frank Jardine with almost supernatural powers. On one occasion, after they thought they'd already killed him, Frank came riding through their camp with guns blazing, apparently risen from the dead. And that would account for a persistent story that circulated from around the time Frank died in 1919. According to legend, Aborigines later dug up the body and buried Frank again head downwards, so their old enemy would find it difficult to rise from the dead a second time. Despite his merciless suppression of resistance and the taint of corruption over his business dealings, to many of the pioneers, Frank Jardine was a hero who conquered a seemingly unbeatable land. But in the end, there was no one to build on what he started, and the remains of Somerset are rusting away, those few items left unconsumed by the voracious tropical termites. Though once in a while you can catch a glimpse of wild cattle, many of them descended from the mob the Jardine boys drove north on their epic journey through 1,500 kilometres of Australia's toughest country. The emptiness of the north has always been a problem from the point of view of defence. One of the reasons the government persisted in the doomed attempt to build a town at the tip of Australia was to stake a claim on the north and to establish a forward base for the defence of the colonies. Even then it was realised that the top was the part of Australia most vulnerable to attack. In the 1890s, everyone feared the Russians, but looking back, most northern defence was pathetic. The concerned people of Cooktown demanded a military base. They were given just one obsolete gun and 3 cannonballs. Fortunately for Cooktown, the Russians never arrived. They took the threat more seriously a little further north. Thursday Island had a fortress with a powerful artillery battery covering the island from all directions. The fortifications and tunnels went deep underground, hiding a garrison of 50 men. Looking back on the so-called Russian threat, we can smile, but the guns ended up serving Australia in another way. Building the old fort was one of the first steps toward federation. First attack on Darwin. The wreckage of flying boats, half buried in the sand of Roebuck Bay, recall an appalling loss of life in a raid on Broome. 9 Japanese fighters machine-gunned the airport and a fleet of flying boats in the harbour. 70 people were killed, most of them women and children. Dutch refugees who'd already been through the harrowing experience of an escape from the Japanese in Indonesia. Ironically, at the time of the war, Japanese communities were well established in the north. One of them in Queensland, on Thursday Island, where the cemetery has a large Japanese section. The Japanese presence here actually protected the island during World War II. Other islands nearby were attacked repeatedly, but the bombers left TI untouched. It's said because a Japanese princess is buried here. The bombers ignored important and easy targets 7 times as they passed over Thursday Island to attack small airfields. Almost 50 years after the war, the wreckage of the conflict is scattered in hundreds of spots all the way over the top of Australia. On Cape York, we find the remains of an estimated 160 aircraft that were shot down or crashed north of the Jardine River. This is what's left of a Beaufort bomber based at Higgins Field, now named Jackie Jackie Airstrip. Another wreck near Jackie Jackie is a DC-3 transport plane. It was carrying supplies to New Guinea from Brisbane and was about to land for refuelling. No one knows what went wrong, and 6 men died. The site, which looks remarkably recent, has been maintained as a memorial to the men killed in the crash. 50 years after its brief interlude as a military stronghold, the peninsula is on the verge of a leap into the 21st century. Cape York has been proposed as the location for an international spaceport. There are mixed feelings about the prospect. On the one hand, it would help bring Australia into the high technology of the space age. It would mean international prestige, jobs and industrial knowledge that Australia has never had before. It would be a trigger for development right through the region, and that worries conservation critics of the spaceport. They believe Cape York's greatest value is in the diversity of ecosystems, landforms and animal habitats. Around 12% of the Cape has been set aside as national park, but conservation groups argue that much more should be preserved as wilderness and wildlife areas. Despite the clear economic benefits, a spaceport would mean the end of Cape York's isolation, and preservation of wilderness areas could no longer be left to nature alone. The Gulf of Carpentaria is an exceptional body of water, far shallower than most of the seas around the coast of Australia. It's a place where shifting sandbars and unpredictable tides make boating a chancy business. But it's an area so rich in fish life that the risks are well worth taking. Gary Wright operates fishing safaris into the Gulf out of Cape York Wilderness Lodge. He probably knows more about the waterways and the fishing in this part of the world than anyone else. He's taking us into Australia's northernmost river, the Jardine, which has the distinction of dumping more fresh water into the ocean than any other waterway in Australia. Despite the volume of the flow, it can be extremely shallow at times, making flat-bottomed swamp boats the most reliable way to travel. There's only ever been one bridge across this river, and that was only a temporary structure built by the military. A bridge would have to be incredibly long to cross the wet season flood. It expands into what early explorers called the wet desert, a confusing maze of swamps, tributaries, and separate arms of the same river.
When we leave the swamp arm, we'll be heading out through the mouth and going south about 8 kilometres down to river number 1.
Rivers further down the Gulf are so remote and rarely visited that they're not even named. They're identified by number.
It's very remote. A lot of country down there that's not touched, never been fished. So we try to make a few trips down there each year, but in total we've only had 36 people down there.
One of Gary's favourite trips is a high-speed run down the Queensland side of the Gulf. Beachfront like this stretches unchanged and unpopulated for hundreds of kilometres at a time. The waters of the Gulf provide both professionals and sportsmen with some of the best fishing in Australia. The open water is alive with a variety of seafood for the world market, while the remote rivers give the sports fishermen a largely untouched paradise. There's an incredible variety of fish in the rivers, and even if many of them do make good eating, you get the feeling that fishermen barely tolerate the likes of mangrove jack, bream, or even salmon. What they really want is barramundi, a catch many anglers say is the perfect sports fish. In creeks and rivers right across the north, the barramundi is considered the king of the sports fish.
You're into one, mate. I tell you what, he's not a bad fish either.
When it reaches a decent size, it puts up a good and often spectacular fight for the fishermen.
He's good. You've turned him. He's good. You've got him right where you want him. Whoop. There he is.
And it's one of the best eating fish in Australia.
Oh, he's got to be every bit of 14 pounds. Well, that one's going to feed everybody, mate. That's a good fish.
But there's more than fish in these waters. Along the banks, we see slides created by crocodiles, and some of the specimens around here are among the largest in Australia. If you have to get out of the boat for any reason, it's done only with extreme care. This bait gathering stop is a dangerous exercise. It's safe enough in the boat, though there have been times when crocs have gone to almost any lengths to attack.
in one incident that happened a couple of years ago, just north of Cairns, a father who was a professional fisherman had his two sons out with him this night, and they set the net on the bank. They were fishing for barramundi, and the two boys rowed the net out and anchored the outer edge of the net and put the light on it, which they're required to do. And just when they finished anchoring the net, they noticed the old fella running along the bank with a torch, waving it wildly. So they motored in quickly, and the old fella jumped over the front of the boat, followed by a fairly large crocodile. And the crocodile got himself wedged on the coaming in front of the boat. One of the boys took an oar and tried to beat the crocodile off and couldn't. So the other boy had the presence of mind to pull up his T-shirt and soak it in outboard fuel and lit it and poked it into the crocodile's face. And that got him, got his attention, and he rolled off the front of the boat.
Gary's boat weapons are a .357 Magnum pistol and a pump-action shotgun. He's only had to use the guns on a croc once in the last 12 years. But Gary, like the other guides up here, wouldn't think of taking out a fishing party unless he was well armed.
Well, this one's a beautiful beach, but it's not quite safe, is it?